Mother finds answers 32 years after her baby is kidnapped. A chance incident in 1988 saw new parents Li and Mao lose their only child. The loss would send the heartbroken mother on a search that would last over 3 decades. For years, she'd be given leads that would ultimately take her nowhere. However, recently, Li ran into a lead that might just be the answer to finally finding her kidnapped child. The mid-80s kicked off to an amazing start for Xi'an's natives, Li Jingzi and her husband Mao. Not only had love sparked between them some years earlier, but in 1985, Li found out that she was pregnant with a baby boy. She gave birth to the bundle of joy on February 23, 1986. While they named the child Mao Yin, they eventually settled for calling him Jia Jia, which translates to great in Chinese. From then on, Li Jingzi would enter the 2 best years of her life. As Mao and Li embraced parenthood, it soon became apparent to them that their Jia Jia was unlike most children. It became quite clear, quite quickly, that Jia Jia wasn't the average baby boy. He was charming, extremely intelligent, and had an infectious personality. Li Jingzi recalls, Jia Jia was a very well-behaved, smart, obedient, and sensible child. He didn't like to cry. He was very lively and adorable. He was the kind of child that everyone liked when they saw him. Li recalled a particular time when she took her baby to the Xi'an Zoo. He was very curious and pointed to a worm, saying, "Mama, worm." And as I carried him out of the zoo, he had the worm in his hand and put it close to my face. Although Li would have spent all of her time with Jia Jia, given a very controversial policy in China, she instead found herself working extra hard. With the goal of slowing down an explosion in their population, the Chinese government put into action the one-child policy in 1979. This meant that Jia Jia would be Li's sole child. There would be no brothers or sisters to keep him company. With that, Li decided that she was going to put all of her efforts into raising him right. Li brought to light just how much love and care she put into the boy when she stated the following during an interview. "Every day after leaving work, I played with my child. I was very happy." He was literally the light of her world. Sadly, the light would dim far sooner than it should have. Despite wanting to spend every waking second with her beloved child, Li had a demanding job with a grain exporting company. This meant that she'd have to leave Xi'an every several days on end and visit suppliers from all around China. When Li was out on business, Jia Jia stayed at home with Mao. During an October 1988 trip, Li got a fax from her employers who demanded that she returned to Xi'an immediately. As she booked it back to Xi'an on an express train, the young mother had no idea what news lay in store for her. On the way back to Xi'an's office, Li's manager looked her in the face and simply uttered, "Your son is missing." Li went on to describe how she felt. "My mind went blank. I thought perhaps he had got lost. It didn't occur to me that I wouldn't be able to find him." At the time, Jia Jia was only 2 years and 8 months old. If lost, certainly someone would pick him up and take him to the local police station. In a surreal daze, Li returned home to find out from Mao how this had all happened. When Li arrived home, her husband Mao was beyond the point of grief. Facing his wife would be no easy task, especially considering how he'd lost track of their beloved Jia Jia. Probably dreading Li's reaction, he explained how it happened. Mao went out to pick up his son at the local nursery. On the way home, little Jia Jia asked his father for some water, so Mao pulled over in front of a hotel. As he was preparing a cup of water for his son, he looked away briefly, and that's when his life would change forever. In the brief second it took to prepare a cup of water, Jia Jia mysteriously vanished from the scene. Mao immediately sprang into action and began looking around the hotel and in the surrounding neighborhood for his missing son. He maneuvered through Xi'an's sea of human traffic and screamed Jia Jia's name through the chatter and honking horns of the urban jungle. It soon became clear to Mao that Jia Jia had been swallowed by the hustle and bustle. There was only one thing that father could do. Mao went home, informed his wife's company about what had happened, and waited for her to return. After hearing the news, Li immediately placed the blame on her husband. Resentment immediately filled her. In her eyes, he was the man who had carelessly lost her child. At this point, while worried, the young mom figured that someone would find Jia. She stated, "I thought perhaps my son was lost and couldn't find his way home, and that kind-hearted people would find him and bring him back to me." Sadly, things wouldn't be that easy. For 1 week, Li and Mao sat anxiously hoping that someone would find little Jia and turn him into the police. After several days, Li decided that she'd need to take action. She began asking around if anyone had seen her son. Li printed out 100,000 flyers and posted them all over the city. She even put ads out in the newspapers across China. She explained during a BBC interview, "My head hurt, I wanted to cry, I wanted to scream. I felt as though my heart had been emptied." It had turned out that things were more serious than she could have ever imagined. During that time, one of China's biggest issues was child trafficking. Most of this stemmed from the country's one-child policy. The policy would allow urban couples to only have one child, while those in the countryside were allowed to have a second child if their firstborn was a girl. Many Chinese couples wanted boys, as they would be able to carry on the family name and take care of them in their old age. This want for boys led to a spike in child abductions across China, Li said. "Sometimes on the TV there would be notices about missing children, but I never thought that they had been abducted and sold. I just thought they were lost." This would have a horrible effect on Li and Mao, as they realized they were the parents of a kidnapped child. Li and Mao's lives were torn apart by the loss of their beloved child. The life the two had together became a shadow of its former self. Their once romantic relationship quickly transformed into a loveless one, and every conversation between them would be about Jia. Frequently, things would turn nasty between them, as Li grew to resent Mao more and more with each passing day. After 4 years on the rocks, it became quite clear that their marriage had no future, and they filed for a divorce. Despite how devastating everything was, that's not the only big change that Li would face. Despite Mao and Li parting ways, Li did not stop looking for her kidnapped child. Every Friday afternoon, Li would get out of work and immediately take the train to one of the surrounding provinces to look for her missing baby boy. She'd then return Sunday night and prepare for another week of work. Her lifestyle quickly became strenuous, and her constant searching eventually caught up with her. Burnt out, Li quit her job and dedicated all of her time and energy to finding Jia. Thankfully, she wasn't alone, as many people would do what they could to help her. Then she got a lead, but it seemed too good to be true. Word got around that a couple from another town in Shaanxi province had adopted a child from Xi'an that looked like Jia. This resulted in Li embarking on an epic journey to find her kidnapped child. She went to their village and waited for the couple to come home from their jobs in the fields. When the workers returned to the village, Li was told that the couple had gone to Xi'an. With that, Li went back to Xi'an and arrived there in the early morning hours. Upon arrival, she began searching throughout the city for the apartment the couple were renting. She was in for quite a surprise when she found it. When Li arrived at their apartment complex, the landlord broke the news to her that the couple and baby had just departed to a different city. She hurried back to the train station and caught the first train out to her next destination. Sleep-deprived and exhausted, Li arrived in the late-night hours and began going from hotel to hotel with the hopes that she'd find Jia in one of them. After hours of searching, Li finally found what she was looking for. She showed the receptionist a picture of her kidnapped child, and he immediately recognized the baby. While the receptionist recognized the boy from the photo, he told Li that the couple had already checked out hours earlier. Despite not sleeping for 2 days, Li took off to the husband's family residence. Sadly, they were not there. Completely drained, Li decided to get some sleep before continuing onward. Once she regained some of her much-depleted energy, she went straight to the woman's house, and when she answered the door, Li could not believe who she saw in the woman's arms. While similar-looking, the baby in the woman's arms was not Li's kidnapped child. The journey across 3 days was all in vain. With her spirit completely broken, Li walked away. She explained her disappointment in an interview with the BBC. Li said, "I thought for sure this child was Jia. I was very disappointed. It had a huge impact on me. Afterwards, I kept hearing my son's voice. My mom was worried I would have a mental breakdown. Li had to make some major changes in order to cope. Li would think about Jia 24/7 and even dream about him as she slept. Her life as a whole had become crippled. She knew at that point that she needed help and checked herself into a hospital. It was there that a doctor told her something that changed her life. He said, "I can treat you for your physical illnesses, but as for the illness in your heart, that's up to you." It was at that moment that Li knew that she had to either learn how to control her emotions or run the risk of losing her mind and losing her chances of finding Jia. This is when she did something every parent would dread. The mere sight of Jia's clothes or toys would send Li into a tearful frenzy. So her sister came over and put all of Jia's things into storage. Li knew that she had to do what she could to avoid getting upset. It was the only way she could be productive about the search. Li connected with other mothers who had lost their children and created a giant network across China. They began sharing thousands upon thousands of flyers and spreading them around every region of China. And luckily, the new network came with some amazing news for Li. While the network helped Li garner tons of new leads, they ultimately went nowhere. However, the work helped her find her true purpose in her life. She eventually got deeper into the field and volunteered with the website Baby Come Home and was able to reunite almost 30 lost children with their families. Every time something like this happened, she'd wonder why it couldn't be her and Jia. In 2015, Li's 94-year-old mother had fallen ill and was fading with each day. During their final conversations, the old woman would talk about missing Jia. It was at that moment that Li promised her mother that she would find her kidnapped child. Throughout the years, Li had talked about Jia on Chinese talk shows and radio programs. She hoped that eventually the exposure and her efforts would lead to a reunion with her long-lost baby boy. And on May 20th of 2020, her dream came true. Xi'an's Public Security Bureau called her up and told her that Jia was found. For an instant, she didn't believe them. Could it be true? However, she took a DNA test and it turned out that they were a match. After 32 years and hundreds of leads that hit dead ends, Li finally found Jia. Now all they had to do was meet. The chosen day of their reunion was May 18th, 2020, at Xi'an's Public Security Bureau Ceremony Hall. As you can imagine, the anticipation was immense and Li and Mao were both shaking. Li said, "Before the meeting, I had a lot of worries. Perhaps he wouldn't recognize me or wouldn't accept me, or perhaps in his heart he had forgotten me." She further stated, "I was very afraid that when I went to embrace my son wouldn't accept my embrace." This clearly wasn't the case. As soon as Jia entered the hall, he literally ran into his mother's arms. The two burst into tears as all of China watched on their TV screens. Over the years, Li had become a household name in China and the whole country was standing behind her when she was reunited with her son. Moved to tears, Jia also embraced his father, who was the last man to see him. Despite the happiness between the three, there were so many questions that needed answering. For 1 month, Jia stayed in Xi'an and spent half of the time with his mother and half of the time with his father. From there, the mystery behind his disappearance would unravel. Finally, Li and Mao would find out what really happened to little Jia on that day back in October of 1988. During Jia's stay, Li and Mao learned that he had been abducted and sold to a couple in the Sichuan province for only 6,000 yuan. That adds up to about $840. Not knowing his name was Jia, they renamed the child Ju Ningning and raised him as their sole child. He was brought up in Chengdu, a city positioned 9 hours south of Xi'an. Jia attended school there, got married, had his own kids, and even runs his own small business now. While Li is proud that her son turned out to be a success, there is one thing that continues to trouble her. Jia was only 2 years old when he was kidnapped. This means that he had no memory of the days when he lived with Mao and Li. Li has tried to help him remember by describing the life they had together back in the 1980s, but the memories just won't come. She went on to say, "This is something that makes my heart ache. After my son came back, he also wanted to find an image or memory of the life he had when he was still with me. But as of now, he still hasn't found it." Despite the joy of finally finding Jia, Li carries on with her one dream that she knows will never come true. While Jia was visiting his mother in Xi'an, they went on a scenic mountain hike together. On the way down, she wanted to carry him, but he was much too heavy. In that moment, Li wished she could get her time back. She wanted nothing more than to return to 1988. She said, "I felt if we could start over again from when he was a child, we could fill this 32-year gap." I said to my son, Jia, can you shrink back to the way you were before? You start at age 2 years and 8 months, and Mama will start at age 28. Let's relive our lives all over again. However, she knew it wasn't possible. Jia had his own life, and the parents that raised him will always come first.